Resident Evil 4 never gets old. I believe this is my first playthrough of the game since the remake came out because I believe what happened last time is that I played through the game just before Resident Evil Remake released. I emphasized that the remake would not do well, that it would not eclipse the original, that no one would care about it or remember it. And yeah, I was completely 100% right with that. Not only has Resident Evil 4 aged spectacularly well, it has officially aged better than the remake, which no one remembers, no one talks about, no one plays. This GameCube exclusive looks and plays better than the remake on other consoles. It's kind of like the Conker's Bad Fur Day situation ever all over again when Xbox bought Microsoft when Microsoft bought Rareware, they remade Conquer as Live and Reloaded for the Xbox. It's the exact same game with better graphics, and yet somehow it is worse. It's kind of remarkable how this consistently keeps happening. How Nintendo has this reputation for being this kiddie company, and yet their horror games, their action games, their M-rated titles are consistently better than the competition. Eternal Darkness was better than the entire Silent Hill franchise. The GameCube era of Resident Evil was the peak of that franchise, and Bayonetta far surpasses slop like Devil May Cry. There are endless examples of this stuff, but I think to a certain extent, Resident Evil 4 is the most interesting case study. Because in this day and age, everyone's willing to acknowledge Resident Evil 4 as one of the all-time greats, the greatest action game, an innovator, this major milestone for video games, the peak of the Resident Evil franchise, this huge, huge deal that is still highly influential and talked about today. And yet, nobody wants to admit what console this thing first released on, the Nintendo GameCube. It was ported to other consoles later, but for a good long while, the GameCube version was the definitive version of the game. And after that, the Wii version, the Wii release, was an improved version with all of the content that never has been surpassed. So Resident Evil 4, alongside like the remake and all of the ports, like the good Resident Evil games are all available on Nintendo GameCube, right? The GameCube is a Resident Evil powerhouse, the console you want if you want the best versions of all these games. And yet, for some inexplicable reason, everybody just kind of turns the other way and pretends that Resident Evil was always this major multi-plat franchise. Not true. This was an exclusive and should have defined the GameCube as the winner of that console generation because this game is so much better than Halo, so much better than DMC or Silent Hill or whatever else slop that people were playing on the PS2 at that time. Resident Evil 4 by itself pretty much eclipsed everything else that everyone else was doing on every other platform and kind of defined what the PlayStation 360 generation would be. That they were all trying to do the same thing or evolve from it. It's kind of crazy looking back at how stuff like Gears of War and Dead Space were pretty much just clearly knockoffs of this. Not as good knockoffs, but nothing ever really eclipsed the GameCube original Resident Evil 4. But did this release, this excellent, critically acclaimed, high selling release, did it make the GameCube a household name? Did older adult gamers, appreciate the GameCube and Nintendo's involvement in this masterpiece? Did anybody realize that the GameCube was the console for everyone, not just kids, that it did have the best adult games? No. Everyone made excuses, complained, tried to say that this game would have done better on other consoles, that it was a fluke, that it was a one-off, that Nintendo would never recapture this kind of thing again. And not only is that not true, it was downright embarrassing just how much people tried to deny the facts that the best third person shooter on any video game platform that generation was a Nintendo exclusive. All the copes, all the seething, all like just the downplaying and the ignoring of reality, all of it just failed to account for the fact that Nintendo won the GameCube era. Now, this is a major controversial like statement because everyone loves to say the GameCube failed, but when you take into consideration like how the Xbox performed and when you take into consideration how the PS2 sales are fake and it was never as successful as it was made out to be, like what you come away with is that the only people who were upset with Nintendo during that generation were aging kids from the 80s. You know, people who were upset about Nintendo making games for kids. You know, like they were making excuses. They were crying about games like Wind Waker existing. You know, like Mario isn't cool and badass anymore. Like, you know, everyone just kind of does this thing where they just fail to accept that the stuff they grew up with, Nintendo like continued to make products that they always have. You know, they were upset at Nintendo for not growing up with them. And that seething continued up until like the Wii U era, where it kind of like reached its apex and then just kind of fell apart as these people started having kids and then they started appreciating the value of Nintendo. Like, so the hate towards Nintendo, the contempt for them, like Resident Evil 4 proves that even when Nintendo puts out a critically acclaimed exclusive M-rated title on their console, this huge, like amazing thing, even when this happens, even in this hypothetical scenario, the community rejected it because they did not want to admit the GameCube was better than the other consoles. They did not want to admit that Nintendo was a major part of what made Resident Evil 4 what it was. They did not want to admit that the GameCube ran the game better than the eventual inferior PlayStation 2 port. Like they just bent over backwards and made excuses downplaying what Capcom accomplished on this title. You know, a title that proves that the GameCube was better than the PS2 because nothing on the PS2 even came close to this. In short, the commonly held cope that Nintendo doesn't make games for adults or that their games aren't popular enough or games that don't appeal to me, like none of that is true because there were plenty of games like RE4 coming out on the GameCube in that era. Eternal Darkness and Geist are two such examples. But the community like completely ignored these games, completely wrote them off, like bent over backwards to create this fan fiction that GameCube wasn't as good as the PS2, and then they sat and watched as games like Super Smash Bros. Melee, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin became these all-time classics, while the PS2's launch title, games like Devil May Cry, games like Ace Combat 4, they went on to be completely forgotten. Like those games were simply not on the level of what Nintendo was producing at that time. And that becomes more and more apparent every year as more and more people discover the GameCube, discover its games, discover what it actually contributed to gaming. And it just raises this very interesting question. Like, how exactly did the GameCube get the reputation it got by having games like RE4 exclusive to it? And the answer is people made up their minds about the GameCube before the console even came out. The narrative was that PlayStation 2 was going to be the cool, mature platform for serious gamers. And not only did that idea never manifest, it completely collapsed with the release of the PS3. And that's definitely something people really need to understand about Nintendo's brand is that the idea that Nintendo suddenly rises and falls with specific console releases is ridiculous and makes no sense. Because something like RE4 continues to was re-released on the Wii, did very very well. Re-released on the Wii U, did really really well, and is now re-released on the Switch and has done very very well. So even with like all these copes and these seeds about how the GameCube isn't this major like milestone gaming platform, the reality is the games on it have established themselves as all-time classics. You know, it is shocking how much time I've put into Pikmin 1 over the past couple of years. You know, it is crazy how much time I put into Super Smash Bros. Melee to get everything in it. You know, it is crazy how much time I put into Luigi's Mansion like over the years. You know, how many times I've played through that game. And those were all games that were wildly hated and ignored by the community to push some weird fan fiction alternate reality that Nintendo was some declining company. You know, after Pokemon was introduced, after it became the biggest thing in the world, you know, during the success of the Game Boy, you know, like this was just before the DS took off, you know, just before the Wii. Like people really thought Nintendo was on the verge of failing when they had games like this exclusive to their platforms. It wasn't based on anything real. It wasn't based on any solid evidence. It wasn't based on their game lineup or on their hardware or anything. Like people wanted Nintendo to fail because they were told that they should fail by the competition, by game journals, by idiots who didn't know what they were talking about. This was a meme in the community. This gamer culture thing that just religiously hated everything Nintendo did. It was embarrassing. And it still is embarrassing for those who still engage with it, but it gets it is strange how much of this mindset persists even today because right now you're still seeing people insist that Nintendo Switch 2 is not selling third-party games. That's been a major talking point with the PC gaming community. They really think that like Mario Kart World is dead now and that Donkey Kong Bonanza hasn't done well and that Switch 2 has nothing on the horizons when it's clearly been a major success story. Like we're really seeing people like cope and seethe about this thing's success, and they're just they're just bending over backwards, doing everything they possibly can to just keep up the facade for as long as possible. But like the reality is, like not only is that not true now, it really wasn't true back then. Because games like Resident Evil 4, games like No More Heroes, games like Metroid Prime 3, like they did do well on Nintendo consoles. The idea that Nintendo audiences never buy like mature realistic games is essentially amounts to the facts that third parties religiously did everything in their power to avoid putting them on the console in general. But whenever they did come out, whenever they did see release, we saw massive success. You know, No More Heroes, I think, is one of the more defining aspects of this, in which a game from a small developer who had a long history of never producing anything that became that successful put out No More Heroes, and it became a million seller on Wii. The narrative became that it would have sold way more on PS3, and so like Ubisoft or Marvelous or whoever produced the PS3 version, added all this new content, and it was a complete failure. You know, like nobody cared for it. You know, like it was an example of just how Nintendo games do well when you build games for Nintendo consoles, and that is something that third-party developers consistently have refused to do. They refuse to even port their games on the platform in a lot of ways, and that has just led to this weird situation, this weird misconception that third-party games don't perform on Nintendo hardware, when in reality, the majority of third-party games never released on the hardware to begin with. It is a gigantic cope. This was the end result of their agenda. They wanted Nintendo consoles to fail. They wanted Nintendo to go third party because third parties know they can't get away with their cheap derivative knockoff slop if they have to compete with high quality Nintendo brands. And so they did everything in their power to gaslight you into thinking Nintendo was going bankrupt, that they were leaving the console industry, that they were going to go third party, that Sony was winning. Like they put all of their games on there trying to make it happen, and in the end, it just didn't. The end result of Resident Evil 4 going multiplat is that Resident Evil Requiem is launching day one on Nintendo Switch 2. Like all that effort to try and go multiplat, to try and avoid Nintendo consoles, has just led Capcom to bending the knee and releasing all Resident Evil games on Nintendo consoles because Resident Evil's legacy is intrinsically tied to Nintendo consoles because of the success of RE4, because of all the GameCube ports, because of all the Wii versions, because of just this franchise establishing itself so well. I would argue that one of the major reasons that Resident Evil has stayed so much more relevant than Silent Hill is because Capcom, more than Konami, has been releasing their titles on Nintendo consoles. And that has led them to establishing themselves more with real players and people who actually enjoy video games. Resident Evil is more relevant because of the decision to put Resident Evil 4 and make it a GameCube exclusive. That is a major reason why this game excels so much. It's why it looks so good. It's why it's so unique, so distinct, so amazing. It is because of the Nintendo exclusivity and how much effort and love Shinji Mikami and his team at Capcom put into making this a true GameCube classic. Nothing that any PS2 developer could ever have done would ever have been able to compete with that.